Well, hello everyone and welcome back to Adrian's Digital Basement. On today's video, I'm going to do a repair on this Amiga 500. This was recently donated by a viewer named Sean. It was a mail call a little ways back on the second channel, and it says it has a green flash, bad RAM. That was my diagnosis in that mail call video. So in this video, let's crack this thing open and see if we can figure out what's wrong exactly. So without further ado, let's get right to it. When I last tested this Amiga 500, it was a very quick diagnosis, and I wrote the note here, green flash, bad RAM, because I think, depending on the Kickstart version, bad chip memory, which of course is required for the Amiga to pretty much do anything, is required for it to boot up. So if that's bad, you're gonna get, I think, a green flash, to maybe a red flash, depending on the Kickstart version. Oh, look at that. Okay, so we do have a fault. I'm pretty sure, well, I mean, of course, the CPU, well, CPU's running. This is a Kickstart thing, so it's doing some diagnostics. Pretty sure that the green screen means that I think there's some problem with the RAM. This onboard RAM here on the motherboard will need some fixing. So the first thing to do is open this thing up and we'll poke around inside. I do notice here that the trap door is taped on, so I think has a broken clip, if I recall. Yep, there it is. Oh, right, okay, and this actually has, no, you know, I think I did open this computer up now that I think about it. This is the RAM expansion card that someone had done, let's zoom in here, this battery upgrade on it using a really cool little PCB that actually adds a diode. And that's because the original battery on these 501 cards is a NiCad rechargeable, so that the power from the computer, the 5 volts, goes into the battery to actually charge it up. That's all you really got to do for a NiCad. So if you're going to use a regular non-rechargeable lithium battery like this, you need to make sure you have a Schottky diode. Well, you could have a regular diode, but a Schottky would be better, less voltage drop, in line with it, which I think is what's happening with this little PCB. So that's cool. And whoever changed this out did it before the corrosion really got to these cards. A lot of these cards have battery damage in this area here from the leaky battery, of course, although that doesn't necessarily result in a bad card because it can damage the clock circuit, which is this part, but the RAM part of the circuit is over here. Alrighty, for Amiga 500s, there are 3 screws along the top edge here, and then there are 3 along the keyboard here. Just take out these 6 screws. Don't take out the ones right here. These are holding in the disk drive. You take those out afterwards. Now, I wish I had written a little bit more on the note, but I'm pretty sure that I did open this thing up, and I think this thing has the same kind of DRAM. Oh, and it's got a missing screw on the top here. I think it has the same kind of DRAM as on this memory card right here. So it's the, what is this, 44256, where 2 chips is 256K because they're 4 bits wide. The older original Amiga 500s have 8 chips, that equals 256K. So it has a total of 16 chips on board for the 512K. But these later ones, and there it is, they have 4 chips for 512K, and then you can actually add sockets and then install 4 more chips and have 1 megabyte right on the motherboard. That renders the need for this card, well, it takes away the need for this card, although if you really want the clock, you do need this card. Now, truth be told, who's really using an Amiga these days where the clock is that important? You only really need the clock if you're doing like productivity applications where having the time and day right is important to you, but not having the clock in there, it doesn't affect the operation of the computer in any way. Now, looking at the motherboard in here, this thing is in absolutely mint condition. There's no signs of corrosion here or anywhere else on the board. It looks like it's a revision 6A motherboard. And as you notice by the empty socket here, I did take out whatever Kickstart ROM was in here, probably because I stuck the diagnostic ROM in here to see if that would work. The CPU that's installed in here is actually a Motorola 6810 as well, which is a little bit of an improvement over the original 68000. There are some slight reasons why you'd want to run this CPU inside a stock Amiga like this, and I think it has to do with WHD load. If you're using that to load games, there are some extra features on the 6810 that allow you to escape out of a game or something like that. I don't remember the exact specifics, but there's a very small performance increase, and there are those few extra CPU features that can be taken advantage by some software. Now, the funny thing is, now that I'm working on this a little bit more is coming back to me. I remember that this thing had a Terrible Fire accelerator that was included with it, but it was not installed in the machine when I got it. I got the computer and the accelerator separate. I think what had happened is that the Terrible Fire actually stopped working, and Sean took it out to try to get this machine working, but the machine actually has a fault as well. Now, I did go ahead and I tested that Terrible Fire. I don't remember if I did it on video, but I did some testing with it in another working machine, and I could not get the Terrible Fire to work at all. When I plugged it into the Amiga to test, the computer would just black screen. It wouldn't even try to boot up at all. It was as if the Terrible Fire card was totally dead. And I actually took the CPU off the Terrible Fire and tried that in another machine, and it works fine. So it's not even the CPU, it is the accelerator card itself that's gone bad. I think it uses a CPLD to actually interface the CPU to the bus or the computer or motherboard, whatever. And I think that chip must be either deprogrammed or is bad. All right, I think right off the bat, I'm gonna install the diagnostic ROM, which I have right here, into this machine. Now, one thing, by the way, I'm noticing is that the sockets installed in here are absolutely terrible quality. They're the kind that can get damaged very easily if you plug something into it that doesn't have the really thin pins that are, well, like on a regular IC chip. I'm not saying that the sockets are going to be bad on here. I'm just saying that that's a possibility. So let's just keep that in mind in case things seem to be acting in a very weird and unusual way in this machine. All right, so what we're looking at here is the test pattern from the open source scan converter, which I have connected to this Amiga right now. Let me turn on the power supply here, and let's see if we see anything with the diagnostic ROM. Okay, so it's flashing red and green kind of alternately. Now, this is the diagnostic ROM, right? These colors aren't the same as the Kickstart ROM, but what we can do with this ROM is connect up a serial cable and look at the console output on this machine. Maybe there's some information there that would be useful. When you're using this diagnostic ROM, and this is the open source one, I'll definitely put a link in the description to the GitHub repository for it. You need to use a no modem cable to connect your other computer to it. So I'm using what used to be called a lap link cable. So it's a no modem adapter that has both 9-pin and 25-pin on both ends of the cable. And that's going into my serial port that is going to my bench PC, my lab PC here. Even though the lab PC is pretty modern, it's like a Ryzen 5600G, the motherboard still has a serial port, a real serial port on it, which is great because not that you couldn't just use a USB adapter with this diagnostic ROM, but there are some situations where a USB adapter doesn't work. My Southwest Technical Products PC 6800, that machine, that is one machine where you have to use a real serial port or a very specific older style key span serial adapter. Otherwise, it's just not going to work. Alrighty, so I have PuTTY open here, and we are looking at the capture from the Amiga on the bottom left corner there. So I'm going to turn this on, and there it is. Okay, so it's telling us here lots and lots of failures. Okay, I think it's just looping over and over again. I'm going to turn the power off here, and let's scroll back. Okay, so this is good. The fact that we're actually getting some output here on this Amiga out of the serial port, that is, tells us some good information. First of all, we know the CPU is working, it's executing code. We know that the ROM is working and it's executing code. That means that the 16-bit data bus is not trashed, like there's no lines there that are being held high or low. It means the address bus is almost certainly working. It also tells us the CPU is able to communicate to the serial port, and we did see some video stuff going on as well, which kind of tells us that the video part of the circuitry in the Amiga is working. Now, I've already talked about this before, and I know this is kind of one of the older versions of the ROM. I can see here it's from 2020 here up at the top. The thing is, it doesn't do the most comprehensive RAM check. It's really kind of like a basic memory check just to make sure the chip memory is working. So it only writes to like certain boundaries of the chip memory and stuff like that. In fact, you can kind of see this here. So it's writing to address 400, and actually, yeah, and then it goes to 8400, and then it goes to 10400. So it's like skipping large chunks of the RAM. So please don't use the memory test that's on this diagnostic ROM as some kind of comprehensive RAM test for the Amiga. And where you can run into problems, and I've run into this problem before, is that the chip memory can be mostly working, but it can have some bad locations. And this diagnostic, unfortunately, is not going to be able to figure out that there are little portions of the chip memory that are bad, which can cause unpredictable results. Once the diagnostic figures out that there is chip memory and it looks like it's working, it then starts to use that chip memory to execute further diagnostics. Well, that's where you run into problems, because if there are problems in that memory that it hasn't tested, then it tries to use it and you get crashes and unpredictable stuff. Now let's take a look at what it's telling us is happening. It's saying that it's trying to write these patterns to memory at location 400, and when it writes this 101010 kind of thing, all it ever gets back is all ones. In fact, no matter what it writes to memory, is always getting back ones. Even when it writes all zeros to RAM, it just gets back all ones. So this RAM that's on here is acting like every single bit is stuck at 1. We're going to use this revision 6 schematic here, which is a recreation, so it's really easy to follow compared to the original Commodore schematics. This motherboard is a revision 6A, but I think it's similar enough to a revision 6, only the minorest changes between the two, so these should be just fine. Okay, so first of all, let's start at the CPU, which is right here, and you see the address lines are there, and then the data bus lines are here. Now these come up here, and they are connected to these bus transceivers and latches. So the 244s are sort of bus transceivers, and the 373s I think are latches. Now let's see what this line goes to. Okay, so it's going to the Agnes. Now I happen to know on the Amiga architecture, the Agnes chip is what actually is sitting between the RAM on the motherboard and the CPU. So when RAM is not working, it could be bad RAM chips, but it also could be a bad Agnes chip, and it could also be bad bus transceivers. In addition, these bus transceivers need to be turned on for them to work properly. And look, you can see these select lines here, they go to the Gary chip. So Gary is the chip that's responsible for those transceivers to even be turned on. So without Gary to tell those transceivers to turn on, Agnes is never going to get any of the data bus signals to even talk to the RAM. Now, let's just talk about the RAM problem for a second. It could easily be that all of these RAM chips are just bad. I mean, that is possible. But it seems weirdly unlikely that all of them aren't going to be working. And the fact is, if we go back to PuTTY, no matter what is written to all the memory locations that it's testing, it's just coming back with all ones. I just feel it's kind of unlikely that all of the RAM chips are going to be bad and returning 1 for every tested memory location. This just seems like something else might be the matter here. Going back to the schematics though, these are the data bus lines again from the CPU, the ones that aren't buffered or latched. And these do make their way over here. They're going to what are labeled just D15 to 0. And when you're looking at the schematics and you're trying to find what else is connected to that particular part of the address bus, you just have to look right here. So DRD, well, we know that that's not it because it has to be D with 15 to 0 without the RD. So here's D15 to 0, and this seems to go to some pull-up resistors, and it goes to a couple pins on the expansion connector there. Here's the Paula chip, but it looks like it's using the DRD as well. Here's the Denise chip, and it's also using the DRD. That means it's going through those same buffer chips. But here's something interesting. Here's the 8520, and that's the I/O chip that talks to the serial port. And notice it's using D0 to 15, so it's unbuffered. So if those buffers are bad, the serial port activity can still work. And what I was really looking for is right here. So this is the ROM chip, and it is also connected directly to the CPU, D15 to 0. So that tells us something really important. That means that if those buffer chips are bad, the ROM is still going to work. It's still going to be able to execute code if the CPU is working, which we know it is. And it's also going to be able to talk to the serial port, which it also is. Now, there is another clue when we turn this computer on that tells us something, and it's that we do get some amount of video output. We're getting the red and we're getting the green and some flashing and stuff like that. And that is the Denise chip that's creating that. And if you look right here, DRD, that tells us that Denise is also connected to those bus transceivers, which I think are going to be these chips right here. So that means that maybe these chips are absolutely fine, and the problem is either the RAM, which it could well be, or it could be the Agnes chip. Now, when we talk about the memory on the Amiga, the Agnes chip is like the memory controller for the Amiga custom chipset. It's like the arbitrator of all the access for the custom chips to the RAM and also the CPU to the RAM. It also handles the DRAM refresh and all that kind of stuff. So we know Agnes is connected to the CPU's data bus through these buffered DRD lines. And then out of that comes like the RAS and the CAS signals for the refresh, also the RAM addressing lines, which are these right here, these DRA lines. And if we go over to the DRAM on the second page here, we can see its data bus lines. Remember, there's 4 bits per chip, and those should be connected to, I think, the DRD lines as well. Yes, there it is. Sorry, it's not scrolling super well. So DRD, so that's the same data bus that the other chips are on. And then if we scroll down here, here's the DRA. These are the address lines that go to the memory. So that's how it's like selecting the rows and the columns and things like that. And it goes through a buffer chip right there, and then it makes its way over to the RAM. And there's also RAS and CAS lines and output enable, stuff like that. So any of these signals not working correctly, like RAS and CAS, or specifically the output enable signals, which actually output enable is tied to ground. So that's going to be always on. But RAS and CAS need to be working properly. And then the WE pin, that's the write enable pin. So anytime the computer tries to write to the RAM, that needs to also go low. So we need to probe around those signals while the diagnostics are running just to see if everything looks correct on these RAM pins. All right, I'm on pin 3, which if we look at the schematic right here, that's the right enable pin. And when I turn on the computer, I'm going to expect to see low pulses here. Okay, we are occasionally seeing low pulses. If I switch this to normal mode and I move this down, and if we zoom in, we should actually be able to see it writing to the memory. So that looks normal. That is what exactly it is doing. By the way, automatic just triggers all the time, but normal will only display a waveform when it's actually triggering. And since the trigger point is right down here, we're only going to see waveforms when the Agnes is telling the memory that needs to be written to, which it's doing. Let's move on to pin 4, which is the, what is the pin 4? That is the RAS line, and there it is. We see a RAS signal that looks good as well. It must have a pull-up resistor on it, which is what's happening there, but that is totally fine. And now I'm on pin 17 on the RAM chip, and that is the column address select line, and it looks good. It's a little bit low voltage, like under 4 volts, like just 3.9 or whatever. That should be completely fine for TTL. Now, the next thing we should look at on the RAM chips are probably these address lines, which are basically going to the Agnes chip. There's really no point to check these data lines because we know that they're connected to the general like buffered data bus lines that go to all the other custom chips on the Amiga, so that all the activity of the CPU talking through those buffer chips to those other peripherals are going to be visible on those lines. So you're going to see all sorts of activity that's not necessarily indicative of what the RAM is doing. The only way to be able to see just the RAM activity would be to look at the CAS and the RAS lines on the RAM and the right enable pin on the RAM, and then correlate that to what's happening on the data bus, because you really need like a logic analyzer. I mean, you could probably do it with a 4-channel scope, but logic analyzer would be a better way to do it. But the fact is, I think we're not quite there yet. There's no need to get to that point with this machine. So we are on address line 0 on the RAM there, and that signal looks totally good, actually. No issues there. Address line 7 looks fine as well. 8 looks fine as well. 9 looks fine as well. I'm just looking for anything that like looks completely wrong from a signal integrity perspective. And there we are on pin 11. Pin 12 looks good. 13 looks good. 14 looks fine as well. And finally, address line 8, pin 15 looks completely fine as well. I'm just going to power cycle the machine, just make sure it comes up immediately. And there, yeah, after a split second, we see pretty much normal activity. All right, so now that we've looked at those signals and everything looks totally fine, I'm going to say that there's 2 possible problems with this machine. There's bad RAM and there's a bad Agnes chip. Now, I think, from my personal experience, I think I'm going to say that the RAM is probably what's wrong with this machine, but it's hard to know, really. The Agnes chip is in a socket, so I can very quickly just swap that out. Now, if you have an Amiga 500 and you don't have spare chips, well, obviously you're not going to be able just to swap out an Agnes chip. And I don't recommend going to buy a spare one before you actually remove the RAM and socket it. But because I can do that, because I happen to have it, I'm just going to pop out the Agnes chip. I turned the power off there. And let's see if that changes things. Now, this is the Agnes chip here. To remove it, you have to use one of these, I don't know, PLCC pullers here. And even with these, it can still be a real pain because these chips can be in the socket. Oh, see, that just slipped right out. So frustrating. And you see what happens when that slipped out, it actually like put a big scratch in the chip and you can like chip the corners off. Normally these chips come out really easily and you basically push this down and you squeeze it, and that has the ability to pull the chip out. But when they've been in the computer a long time like this, it can be really, really hard to get out. And these chip removers are not the best things in the world. They're cheap and they're just not super good quality. Oh man. That sucks. This thing is just a piece of junk. Piece of junk. Now I happen to have another one here. It looks a little different. Let's see if this one works better than that one I was just trying to use. Aha, this one works better. Okay. So I'm going to throw that other one out because this one is just a piece of garbage here. Goodbye. Hopefully the chip didn't get damaged. It looks okay, but like the cheap ones can take the corners off these and damage these chips. So you have to be careful about them. All right, here's a couple chips. This is the one on my right that was in this machine. It's an 8372A, and I have another one here, an 8372A as well. It's got the markings that are mostly marked off, but I think this does work. I'm just gonna deoxit the socket first, just to make it a little easier to go in and out. I'm noticing that this Agnes chip actually has a little bit of corrosion on it. This is not the one I just took out of the machine. This is the one I had spare parts. I don't actually know if this one fully works. Incidentally, there's a little dot right there, and there's a pin 1 marked on the motherboard. that is the way you can insert this thing the correct orientation. Not to mention there's actually a little notch in the PLCC socket as well. There we go. So that is in there. Let's see if that changed anything. Here we go. I guess I should be looking at the serial output. Nope. Serial output is exactly the same. I know you can't see it, but it's just identical error messages. So that implies that it's the RAM that's the problem the whole time and not the Agnes chip whatsoever. I'm just going to pull this Agnes chip out of here, the one that was the spare, and I'll put back in the original one, and then we will take out the RAM. So I'm using this puller again, and look, that works so much better than that other one. This is a great puller. I don't know where it came from. Sorry, I can't give you any tips there. I feel bad that I put some scratches on this Agnes chip right here. Let me just turn that on real quick, see if there's any difference. No, okay, exactly the same. It's just same error messages. Alrighty, let me find some RAM. We'll try a piggyback method first and see if that makes any difference at all. Okay, so the RAM that's here is Fujitsu memory, and all the chips are. Now on the RAM board that was inside this computer, it is Siemens memory. I think Siemens memory is a little bit more reliable. I happen to have a piece of memory here, and I think this is actually 44256. It was in a bag that was labeled as such. I don't recognize the part number though, but we're just gonna try piggybacking it anyways and see if this makes a difference. With the chip held down, I am gonna turn this on and let's see if this changes anything. No, nothing is changing at all. We're still getting all ones on everything. These chips that are on here, if they are indeed bad, whenever they're read, they might be writing back all ones. Well, if you try to piggyback a chip, it's gonna be conflicting. It's basically gonna be trying to drive the bus to 0 and the other chip's gonna drive it to 1. Usually the ability to drive something to 0 is stronger on a TTL chip than it is to drive to 1. But who knows, you know, what's happening with these two chips fighting like that. I'm gonna move this onto a different position and let's see if that changes anything at all. I'm just looking for any zeros at all. No, nothing at all. Now I just went into my parts bin. I found a couple more 44 256s. So I'm sure about these. The part number on this one I just don't recognize. So let's try piggybacking one of these. This is an NEC chip on top of these and see if that changes anything. We're still seeing all ones. The only thing to do at this point, in my opinion, is to socket the RAM chips. And I'll start by socketing just one chip. Because if I put in a new RAM chip into one of these sockets, then we should see 4 of the bits on the RAM test start to work. And if we see that, then we know for sure that all the other components on this machine are working okay, and that's really the only problem there. So then we'll probably have to socket the rest of these RAM chips as well. If I put a socket in and I put a new chip in there and we're still seeing all ones, then the problem lies elsewhere. I was just about to pull the motherboard out, but I let the diagnostic finish all the way. And look at the end here, it actually says no chip memory detected. And then it goes to this like flashing pattern on the video output and it's trying to use some other memory, says fast mem, as no chip memory is found. Here's a test. Let's put this RAM card in here because this, in this particular Amiga, I think this becomes chip memory or maybe it's other memory. I can't remember what this becomes, but let's pop this in because maybe this diagnostic ROM can actually use this card as additional memory. Okay, so the RAM card is in and it's going through the Agnes. Let's see what happens now. Power this up and here we go. Wait, the diagnostics are working now? What's going on? What? Okay, so scrolling back, the beginning of the diagnostic, it was writing to address 400 and that actually resulted in it was working. It just doesn't even make sense because the memory that's on the card I just put in doesn't exist at 400. That's the motherboard memory. This is separate. So what? What? Is this chip memory on the motherboard disabled? Like did someone cut a trace or something and completely disable this onboard memory? That doesn't even make any sense, but maybe this is what's happening here. So looking on a little further, so start address is 400, end address 7FFFF, number of 32K blocks, 10 hex, which is how much memory is on this card here. It's 512K. With this card and the motherboard, we should have a total of 1 megabyte of memory, but normally the way it works is the motherboard memory is the chip memory, And what's on the card here is like other memory or slow memory. And it's doing some other things, and I'm keeping scrolling down. It seems to go into some kind of like further mode. And it looks like it is no longer going to be communicating with the serial because it wants me to push a key, and I didn't do that. Enable it in program. Thing is, this, what you see right here, is what's coming out of the video output on this machine, which is nothing. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to push a key on the serial console here once it comes up with that prompt. Now we're not seeing an image right now because the capture device is slow to. What do I do? Push a key? No, not yet. It's like it's working, but it's not working. What's happening here? Something is still acting very strange here. I have the Amiga keyboard plugged in, so I'm going to power this thing back up again. I'm going to push a key to hopefully allow us to use the serial console as opposed to what's on screen. Okay, I pushed a key. There it is. Okay, so system info. All right, so I'm on this screen here, and I don't seem to be able to exit out of it. I don't think this keyboard is actually working properly. I know you can't see it because I'm holding it right here, but like caps lock doesn't do anything. I don't know, this computer maybe just froze too. Let's power cycle it again. See what happens. I don't understand really why the computer's kind of working with this card in there. Okay, I hit the space bar. Let's do video tests or graphics tests. So test picture. So we're not even getting any image. You can see the image there. And I think that might be because the RAM that's on the motherboard is what's really used for the Denise chip to display information on the screen. That RAM, I don't think is working. And I just don't understand why the diagnostic, and I don't know what happened there. We just lost the video picture entirely. I think the diagnostic ROM is somehow detecting this extra RAM as chip memory. Oh, but look, we just got a failure. So no chip mem found. Okay, I don't know. Plugging in this card seems to have somehow made the onboard RAM kind of work, kind of, but not really. It's very strange. I'm going to try this one more time here. Power cycle. So it detected 512K. Press the space bar. Nothing on the screen. We get that like weird green picture there. And if we go to memory test, and let's do test detected chip memory. And I don't know, is this just, I don't know, that didn't really work. 2, okay, here we go. Checking full chip mem area until 2 megabytes. The diagnostic appears to have just frozen. So I'm not exactly sure what's going on. Again, I think it all points back to this RAM on the motherboard. And this weirdly feels so familiar. I think I had a similar Amiga, like one of this same revision, that had really weird memory issues as well. And I think it was very, very similar to this, where it just was acting unusual and weird, which is what's happening with this. And it just seems weird that plugging in this card makes it behave a little unusual. Okay, I think what I need to do now is just do what I was gonna do, and let's socket one of these chips. And I have a feeling I'm gonna have to socket all 4 of them. So you know what? I'm just gonna go ahead and socket all 4, because this seems eerily familiar that what's going on with this machine. I have a feeling all these RAM chips are bad, and socketing them and replacing them will fix this machine. All right, there it is. All 4 of the memory chips have been removed. Sockets have been installed. I also cleaned out all the holes for the additional memory chips that you could go up to 1 megabyte on the motherboard, but I didn't reinstall sockets because I don't actually have enough RAM chips to even fully populate this motherboard. As it is, I only have 4 that I think might be good. So we have the Retro Chip Tester Pro here, and let's take one of these chips that I removed and see if these test good or not. So these take a long time to test with all the RAM tests enabled on here. It's interesting, it's checking 0 right now, and that's working. 0 as in it's writing 0 to it, it's getting zeros back, which is not what we got when we were testing on the machine. The diagnostic reported always getting back FF. Either way, I'm gonna run through all these tests and then I'll do a jump cut. Okay, so I tested one of the chips. Takes a long time on the Retro Chip Tester Pro for 256K chips. And as you can see, it passed. So that's not a good sign. So I put the 4 chips back in the motherboard and I did mark the one that I tested good. And while I was testing, I started looking around the motherboard and I remembered that the Agnes chip on here is the Fat Agnes, which has the capability of supporting 1 megabyte of chip memory or 512K of chip memory. And there was a jumper, which was a couple solder pads with a trace in between them to cut. And here's the Agnes chips, the 8732A in the case of this machine here, and A19. This is the jumper, if I recall, that allows it to select either 1 meg of chip memory or 512K of chip memory. I am pretty sure if you connect address line 19, which is this one right here, to address line 19 on the Agnes by moving this jumper down from address line 23, then you end up with that 1 meg. Well, that jumper is right here on this particular motherboard, and zooming in, it looks like that jumper's been manipulated. So it seems like this particular computer is configured for 1 meg of chip memory, which means it's definitely not going to work properly. Well, I don't think it's going to work properly. I mean, I don't actually know what happens if that jumper is set that way and you don't have the RAM expansion card in there. Thing is, we had the RAM expansion card in there and it was still acting very weird and strange. So I don't know what's going on. I think I should restore this jumper back to the original configuration and then let's see if it works with just this motherboard memory. Now, the funny thing is when I think about who owned this computer, it was someone that had the accelerator in here. This is actually a logical thing that they would have done because that's a desirable setting to have 1 meg of chip memory on an Amiga, especially if you have lots of fast memory. So I'm just cleaning off this solder there. I could see there's a trace that's been cut on there, and that's how it was disabled, the 512K, and upgraded to 1 megabyte. I should have probably done a little bit of more thinking first and then realized that that would be set that way. Okay, there we go. So now none of those jumpers are set. I'm just gonna re-bridge the one that connects address line 23. That was the original stock configuration. Anyhow, as I was saying, I should have used my brain a little bit more and realized that that might have been done. And maybe the entire time is the problem lies on this card. I don't actually know what happens when you have an Amiga set for 1 megabyte of chip memory and you take out half that memory. Theoretically, maybe it'll still work, but maybe not. And it's quite possible that the Agnes chip maps the part of the graphics screen and stuff up into the top part of chip memory, which is missing until you plug this card in. And then maybe once I plug this card in, maybe there's a problem with the RAM on this card. And that was causing the problem the whole time. All right, let me plug the video and the power back into this motherboard here, and we can bench test this out of the case. I'm just double checking the RAM is in the right way it is. And here we go, let's turn this on. No picture? Wait, I don't even have Putty open. I don't see what Putty is complaining about. Oh, look at that. It's freaking working. It is freaking working. So the problem the whole time, I'm assuming, was this memory card. I mean, you know, I don't remember when I did my initial testing if I tested with or without this memory card installed, but clearly this RAM on the motherboard totally works, and the problem might be on here. So I'm going to connect this card in, and we'll see what happens. Incidentally, there's also some jumpers right here, which, you know, you have to cut the trace and stuff to alter them. But what they do is they swap the memory around. So they'll put the low part of chip memory onto the RAM card and then the high part on the motherboard. I didn't even realize those jumpers were there until I was looking at the schematics while the RAM test was going on, but if I did, I probably should have done or manipulated those jumpers because that would have allowed me to run the chip memory on the external card and see if that was the problem. All right, so I have the keyboard connected so I can manipulate the on-screen displays. You know, every time I work on an Amiga, I make all these mistakes, and this is no exception here. Okay, so it's detecting chip memory, 512 kilobytes, fast memory 0, which is correct. So is that card definitely not working, is the question. Memory test. So this is where it was freezing before when I was plugging in that card. Checked memory, usable memory. All right, so let's let it like run through this test. I'm thinking now the other memory, which is like the slow memory, must exist, since it had the address line 13 there, it must exist like way up at the top of memory space. And I actually don't know if this diagnostic ROM can even detect that memory. One thing I could try is just installing a Kickstart ROM and letting the thing boot up, and Kickstart will be able to tell me if there's high memory or not. And then I could run the test kit disk to test that memory. All right, address error detected. That's not helpful at all. I don't know what this means at all. What does this mean? I think what I should do is turn this off, and I'm going to pull the RAM card, and let's test again just with the onboard memory. Let's see if that makes a difference. The RAM tests on this ROM are just not that good. And basically, I've had lots of issues with this RAM test, just detecting problems with the RAM that didn't actually exist. So I think probably the best thing to do is I'll just plug the floppy drive in now, and I put a Kickstart ROM in, let's boot up into the Amiga test kit disk. I trust that disk a little bit better than I trust this ROM to actually tell me if the RAM is good or not. Okay, so it halted in exactly the same way. And again, I don't necessarily believe that this is a problem. So, okay, I'm going to swap over to the an actual Kickstart ROM, and let's run the test kit disk. Let's see what this does. To be honest, I don't even know if 1.2 works in this revision of board. Okay, that's something. Let's see if the test kit disk actually works with 1.2. I don't even know. Alrighty, let's see. I have a floppy drive connected. I don't know if this drive works because this computer never booted up far enough. Okay, sounds like, oh, hey, look, there it is. There's nothing wrong with this computer. I totally desoldered those chips for no reason. Let me run a RAM test now. Okay, I have an Amiga mouse which I connected. It appears to be moving. Memory. There it is. So this detects that 0K of slow memory, which of course means I don't have this plugged in. Let's test all memory. Now this is really quick about it. And let's see what happens until it gets to round 2 dot whatever. That means, okay, so it already passed a full test. I'm gonna put this card in here next. Let's see what happens with this. Okay, so it turned on, and let's run the memory test. Oh, it's not even detecting slow memory. So that really does imply that this card is problematic. I have another card. I'm gonna go grab it. Okay, here's another Amiga 501 type card. I don't know if this is an actual Commodore one. I don't think it is, but it does work. So I'll pop that in. Let's turn this on. So I guess the problem is this thing was set for 1 meg of chip memory, and I didn't realize that. I didn't think to look for that. And if this card is indeed bad, we'll find out in a second. Let's just see if we see the other memory. Oops, that's not what I meant to do. Memory. Oh, look, it's not detecting slow memory here either. So that's odd. What could be causing this exactly? Whatever's wrong on this computer, half the memory doesn't seem to be working, like whatever is plugged into this memory expansion card. Which, if you have the computer set to 1 megabyte of memory, when it goes to use the other half of the chip memory, it's not there, and that's why the Kickstart would be flashing that green screen, saying there's a chip mem problem. As for why the diagnostic ROM was not working at all, I mean, it should have still detected half the memory, but maybe that's just not the way the Agnes works. If you have it set for 1 meg and you have half the memory missing, maybe it kind of totally freaks out. Okay, so after all this time, After all this time, I think I finally figured out at least what the fault is with this machine, and it's that the RAM and the expansion card isn't being seen. Because it was set to 1 meg of chip memory, that caused it to not boot anymore, and that led me down the path of thinking that the onboard memory was bad when it really wasn't. Now, I just realized that my camera here has died. The battery, I guess, has run out, which is weird because it's plugged into power. So that's a sign. I think I'm gonna stop the cameras, let them charge up, and try to wrap my brain around what exactly is going wrong with this Amiga. And hopefully I can get this RAM card working, which means I can restore it back to 1 meg of chip memory. All right, I took a break, I had a little dinner, and I think I figured out what's going on. So we know this motherboard has been, molested, so to speak, where that trace was cut on the one jumper that selected 1 meg of chip memory. Now, taking a look at the schematics, we're back on the page with the memory, and this here, these pins are the actual, it's the memory expansion connector here that goes to the RAM card. And notice over here, there's a jumper, JP7A, and it goes to a signal called EXTICK, EXTICK. That particular signal can be found right here, and it goes into Gary. Now, I think what that signal is for detecting if the RAM card is installed or not. And the reason why I say that is because we go back and we look at the options for that jumper, which are either grounded or connected through to the pins that go to the card. We scroll down to the end of the schematics here. Cake is an Amiga 501 type expansion card. And on pin 32, there it is. That's the EXTICK, EXTICK signal. And there's a jumper on the card that basically grounds it. So really, if we look at that signal, it can either be grounded by the card that's plugged in, or it can be grounded on the motherboard by soldering a blob between, and if we zoom in a little bit, there it is, between pin 2 and 3. But the default configuration is 1 and 2, which goes through to the memory card. Now, let's grab the multimeter here, put it on continuity. There is the jumper right there. So the middle pin is pin 2 on the schematic there. And I know it's not going to be apparent in the camera, but I looked really carefully with a magnifying glass, and sure enough, the trace is cut that is in between pins 1 and 2. And right now, there is no continuity between the middle pin and either of the other pins. Now, I think that that signal is used to tell Gary that the expansion card is installed. And the reason why you'd ever want to just short it all the time to ground is because on this particular motherboard, you can install the RAM on the motherboard, which is kind of the equivalent of having the expansion card installed all the time. So I almost feel like what's going on, at least right now, when I have it set for 512K chip RAM, is that because this jumper has been cut, it's never detecting that the card is actually installed. Now, what I don't totally remember is that if you set the system to 1 meg of chip memory, that you need to cut that jumper and have it not connected at all. I don't really remember how that works. So let's see if I restore that jumper back to the original configuration, if suddenly this card is now visible as, slow memory. All right, let's turn this thing on. By the way, the card that's in here right now, I know 100% works perfectly. I was using it recently in another Amiga 500 and it was fine. So the computer is booting up right now. Let's see if it detects the memory now. We go to memory. There it is. Okay, so slow memory is being detected. So if we list the memory regions, here they are. The first one is the chip memory. That's what's built in the motherboard, which we know works fine. And it's this second one, the slow memory here. And if we test this, we'll let this run through a full cycle on the card I know works, and then we'll pop in this card and we'll see if this works. And actually, yeah, it's already gone through a cycle there. It's on 3.1, so we know that that is good. So we'll power off the machine, and I'm gonna swap these cards over. Alrighty, there we go. Now, this should show up as 512K of slow memory as well. The system is booting, so that's a good sign. Let me go to memory. Oops, that was keyboard. We go to memory, we go to list, and let's test this region here. I guess this is working too. Okay, yeah, this is working as well. Okay, now what I'm gonna do, turn the system off, I'm gonna put the jumper back to be 1 meg of chip memory, because that's a more desirable memory configuration. You wanna have as much chip memory as possible. It means there's more room for sound and graphics and stuff like that. And if you have fast RAM, that's even better. So let's fix this jumper. All right, I switched out the chip memory jumper. I haven't touched the X-Tick one. Let's turn this on now and see if it's detecting 1 meg of chip memory. I mean, this might have been the problem the whole time. There might not be any fault with this computer. Ah, look. It's not booting now. So that's interesting. That is very interesting. I wonder if one of the things you need to do is remove this jumper here if you have it in the 1 megabyte chip memory configuration, so to speak. Before I go changing the jumpers, I'm going to put back in the card I know works for sure. I mean, obviously the other one was testing okay, but just in case, let's put this known good card in and let's see if that does anything different. Yeah, it appears to not be working. Now, there is one thing to consider, is that it could be that Kickstart 1.2, which is what's in here right now, does not support 1 meg of chip memory. Okay, I have a working Kickstart 2.0 ROM in here and I'm getting absolutely nothing with it still set for 1 meg chip memory with this jumper set. So I'm gonna undo this jumper here. I'm gonna cut that trace, basically put this thing back to the exact configuration it was in when I started. Alrighty, here we go. 1 mega chip memory, it's selected there. I took away the blob of solder there, so basically that X-Tick line is completely disconnected. So Gary's gonna think that no memory card is installed. And let's turn this on. What's happening? It's booting. Oh boy, this is the most useless video ever. There it is, 1 meg of chip memory. I'll do a test and then we'll go back and then we'll go back to the original card that came with this computer. And let's see, let's just wait for it to get to 2.0. And if this just all works, then this there, yeah, that's working. Then there's no fault with this computer, and all of this troubleshooting and work has been me not understanding how Amiga 500s work, and there's going to be a whole lot of people screaming at their screens telling me that I don't know what I'm doing. It's freaking booting. Oh, I cannot believe this. So much waffling on my part for a computer that works? That worked the whole time? Why did I had that note on there that said green screen, which almost certainly is going to happen if I take this memory card out. That is the worst thing here. So yeah, there we go. The RAM check is working. If I take this RAM card out and we turn this computer on, almost certainly I'm going to get the flashing green screen. Okay, wait a second. Wait a second. What is going on here? Memory, 512K of chip memory. So that answers my question. If you have it set for 1 meg of chip memory and you take the memory card out, the computer works. But we saw it wasn't working. I'm going to put back in the diagnostic ROM. Unfortunately, I didn't actually turn this on to test that we were getting the flashing green. But what we did get for sure is when I put the diagnostic ROM in, this one here, which is the Amiga Diagnostic ROM, the open source one, and with PuTTY up on the screen and I turn it on, I don't understand. I absolutely do not understand. The system is freaking working. What? What's happening? Okay, so I don't understand what's going on because we have it on video that it was set for 1 meg of chip memory and it was set for, you know, no detection of the RAM card, just like it is. And with the RAM card removed, none of the RAM was working. None of it was working at all. The only thing I can think of at this point is I need to start editing this footage to see if there's something else I did. I didn't do anything. The RAM is just working. I haven't touched any of the other Amiga chips. I didn't like take Gary out, put it back in, nothing. The only chip I took out and put back in was Agnes, but we saw that taking that and putting a new one and didn't change anything, and I went back to the original one. No change. everything took a turn when I desoldered the RAM and put the existing RAM, these are absolutely the existing Fujitsu RAM chips, back in the board. And now it's just working. Only thing I'm thinking of is like these chips were marginal and the heat, like heating them up, fixed them temporarily. I mean, I've had this happen before. Otherwise, I honestly have no idea what's going on at all. Wow. All right, well, I don't know what else to say other than I should probably put this machine back together and then leave it running RAM diagnostics for hours and hours. Like leave it turned on and see what that does. So I'm gonna do that right now. So at this point, I don't really know what else to say. The computer has basically self-healed itself. The original RAM is definitely in here. The original RAM card is definitely in here. I restored the jumper settings back to the exact way that it was on this machine when we started. And at this point, it's just fully functional. I'm pretty much baffled as to what just went on. This is a rather long video of me just fiddling around and basically getting nothing done because the computer works. Incidentally, the keyboard fully works. I tested all the keys with the Amiga test kit. All the keys work, so that's a nice change. It's a membrane keyboard as well, so I was pretty much concerned that some of the keys weren't gonna work, but no, everything works really well. And actually the top lid, which is right here, it's not fully dry, had a bunch of scuff marks on it. I used the baking soda method to clean that off. I just sort of gave it a good clean first and then used the baking soda on any of the scuff marks, and they came right off. And upstairs, I put it to the sink and with soap and water to clean inside the vents using a brush. So the top lid looks really good. The only thing that's left to clean on this is there's some gunk between the keys. And strangely, a few of the keys are a bit yellow. So I'm wondering if those broke off at some point and maybe they were swapped from a different keyboard or something like that. But the functionality of the keyboard works. The disk drive is working. The rest of the computer seems to work perfectly as well. I did a little bit of quick testing as well off camera, and what a mystery. What a freaking mystery. So I think it's time for the conclusion. All right, I guess that's gonna be it. Test drive is running on the machine, so it does run software perfectly. Like I said, it's working absolutely perfectly at this point after doing nothing to it. So there you go. If you like this video where I floundered around trying to fix a computer that seemingly fixed itself, thumbs up. But if you didn't like it, you know what to do. Thanks to my patrons, their names are scrolling up the side of the screen. Huge thanks to Sean, who was the original person who sent in this machine. Sorry the fix was so unsatisfying. I don't know what else to say about that. So if you have thoughts about what happened here or why this machine went from not working to working, comment down below. Definitely would be really interested to hear what your thoughts are on that. And yeah, I guess that's gonna be that. So stay healthy, stay safe. I will see you next time. Bye-bye.